All right, we're going to begin with the first of the modules on affective disorders. The word affect itself is a synonym for mood. So earlier you saw the word affective. So affect is a synonym for mood or emotion. It's probably more appropriately emotion rather than mood. And so this particular area talks about the mood disorders, beginning with depression. So depression is an emotional state that most of us out there have a sense of. It is when we experience great sadness, loss of pleasure. In the more extreme cases, there is a sense of hopelessness and worthlessness. Now, to be diagnosed or to experience depression, it is not to have what would be an ordinary level of sadness. This is when there is a functional impairment due to the degree of sadness. So a person may not be attending school and classes, they may have trouble with work, or they may not be socializing due to the symptoms of their depression. There are several different types of depression. There is something referred to as major depressive disorder, and major depressive disorder impacts people for a minimum of 2 weeks, where a person might experience the symptoms of depression that we alluded to earlier, with many more that we didn't allude to, for most of the day, nearly every day, for a 2-week period of time. There is also something referred to as a seasonal pattern or seasonal affective disorder, which is what happens when people get depressed when there are changes of the season. Most often we experience this when daylight savings occurs and there's less daylight, or when people live in environments where there is less daylight, they may experience a seasonal pattern to depression. Postpartum depression are the types of depression that generally women will experience, and it happens after the birth of a child for a given period of time, and it lasts up into a few months, after which the diagnosis might shift into something else. And then more recently there was a new diagnosis in the DSM-5 of persistent depressive disorder, which is a depression that lasts for much longer than a 2-week period of time. There's a synonym for that, or a different version of this is called dysthymia, which is a low-level, consistent type of depression. We know that depression shows some abnormal activity within the brain. In particular, we know that the neurotransmitter serotonin is implicated, where we believe there are lower levels of serotonin in the brains of those who are experiencing depression. It's not so easy to differentiate whether the depression causes the low serotonin or if low serotonin causes the depression. But we do know that there are lower levels of serotonin. And we also are aware that the regions of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, or the amygdala, are implicated in brain functioning of people with depression. We know that, unfortunately, experiencing depression can increase people's risk for suicide, both in terms of suicidal thoughts and suicidality and fantasy, as well as the potential for taking steps towards suicide. Very concerning aspects of depression, and one that we know leads to a lot of attention being given to depression. This is with elevated numbers occurring on college campuses, and the highest actual rates of suicide and suicidality existing within the geriatric population, the older population. White men 75 and older are actually the highest group at risk for suicide. Now, in terms of talking about the etiology or some of the theories or roots of depression, we know there is a strong belief of the diathesis-stress relationship, which states that we have a predisposition towards a depression, perhaps due to a genetic underpinning or biological features that out of birth might make me more susceptible to depression, and that the stressors of my life come into play and increase the probability that the underlying depression will unfold. The cognitive theories are quite well known and well researched today. Research put forward by Aaron Beck and his belief in the negative triad, which is the presence of negative beliefs in self, the world, and the future. So Aaron Beck believed that people with depression had a higher degree of negative thoughts about themselves, about the world in general. So I'm a terrible person, I'm no good, I'm never going to succeed, the world is against me, there's no way for me ever to succeed in this world, and the future is hopeless, there's no way that I can make something of myself in the future. That's Beck's cognitive triad. There is a theory about hopelessness that people who develop a sense of hopelessness are much more prone to depression. People who are prone to helplessness are much more prone to depression. And a theory called learned helplessness by Martin Seligman states that people actually learn through experiences with their environment that they don't have a chance at being happy because they've been disappointed so many times in the past that they just become accustomed to being depressed, as it were, and learn to be helpless. And the notion of rumination is another part of the cognitive theory, that people ruminate and have repeating thoughts of negative tints that remain in their mind, almost, as it were, to a degree like a obsession in the mind with these thoughts being repeated. Another form of mood disorder is referred to as bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a much more severe, it can be a much more severe condition, one that has either a oscillation or a vacillation between states of depression, as we described before, and mania. Mania is, rather than being depressed, which is low energy, low mood, low activity level, lack of interest in things, lack of socialization. Mania is the opposite. A high degree of socialization, overly energetic, the ability to be up and awake for many days in a row, to be hypersexual, to be spending way more money than one should be spending at a given period of time. And at times, a person in a manic state can even become psychotic and have delusions or hallucinations. So and by the way, these manic episodes last 7 days and can require hospitalization. And there is a lower level of this called hypomania, which lasts 3 days. A 3-day, which is kind of a shorter version of hypomania. So to have both depression and mania at the same time leads to a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. You only need to have one of these manic episodes to be considered bipolar, along with depression. There are much more technical aspects of this, but for the sake of the CLEP, this should be enough. Finally, a few other facts about bipolar disorder. They have a very high comorbidity rate. Comorbidity means that along with having one particular condition, you also are diagnosed with a second condition, so they are comorbid, they coalesce, they come together. And so bipolar disorder has a high degree of coalescence or comorbidity with anxiety disorders, substance abuse disorders, and some personality disorders such as borderline personality disorder, which we'll talk to about in a few moments in a different module. We know that bipolar disorder there's some slight indication of men having more bipolar disorder than women, but not by much. It's really pretty close. Depression is much higher in women than in men. And suicide rates are quite high within the bipolar population, where there's a 36% attempt rate and a 15 to 19% completion rate. So a very significant disorder. In terms of etiology, bipolar disorder has a much stronger genetic link to it versus just straight depression. And the treatments of bipolar disorder is a very different treatment, requiring primarily the use of lithium, and there are other versions of treatments for bipolar disorder, but different than what we treat for depression. Okay, so that about covers it for the affective disorders, and we'll pick up in a few minutes with the anxiety disorders.